welcome. We like to start this conversation with a very human question, which is, how are you? How are you arriving at this call today? How are you as as a human today?
So I'm arriving from Rio with, if you know Rio, you know that means I'm arriving with a lot of contradictions, I guess, because this is a city of contradictions. So it's a beautiful day here today. The sun is shining, the weather is warm, but it's been a tough week on some regards here. And I think we're always dealing with that. We live in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, but also one of the most unequal.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is part of how you show up when you're navigating the city. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm feeling present, a little heavy, but genuinely glad to be here. So,
Oh, that's amazing. No, I've not visited Rio yet, but it's definitely on my list to come to. And hopefully, with some of the research I'm doing, I'll be visiting Brazil. So I
you should
will
absolutely do that.
definitely come
Yeah.
and meet you in real life. Would be wonderful. So yeah, can you tell us a bit about yourself as a human? You know, when also you feel most alive, when you feel most human.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are the kind of obvious ones, right? I'm a mom. I have two kids. I have a 7-year-old and a 1.5-year-old.
Oh wow.
And I definitely feel alive when I'm with them, but very specifically, they love dancing and I love dancing. And I think it's something that I was able to impart on them a little bit.
Amazing.
And we do these kind
Amazing.
of dance fests every night before bedtime when we just kind of dance our worries away. And I love doing that. So that is one
Oh,
thing. And
incredible.
then I guess like I really love stories, and I think that the most
Mm.
human thing about me in many ways is that I'm deeply, sometimes embarrassingly moved by stories. So I can be sitting watching a kind of cheesy soap opera at 11 at night, and find myself crying because this character that I've followed for weeks has finally, you know, done something that we've been rooting for them to do. And this is very, it's definitely part of my upbringing, like having those very common stories that everyone follows nationally. Um, and I think that capacity to be swept away by fiction, by narrative, by the humanity in a performance, I think
Yeah,
that's actually been the engine of my work in many ways.
yeah, yeah.
So, yeah. And then I love seeing that in other people. So when something that I make or that we made reaches someone who wasn't expecting to be reached, when they are moved by the stories that we are telling, that is really cool.
I
And
love
and I
that. And
feel a
that's
certain kind of connection that I don't feel in other settings.
yeah, absolutely. And whether that storytelling is through dance or whether that's through film
Yeah.
or TV or, through books. Yeah, there's so many different ways of telling those stories. I'm a fellow dance mum, so
Aha,
my
there you
son's a
go.
dancer, so I get that. That's brilliant. And that leads us on
Yes.
really nicely to the next question, which is really to tell us a bit about your work. And you've touched on stories. How have they, sort of formed part of your work, your organization? Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I run a company called Pity, and Pity is a media company. Our whole reason for being is stories that matter, and ensuring that there are stories out there that can really genuinely change how people see each other, how they see the world. So that's our DNA, and we also we're partly a production company, but partly also a manager of media assets. And we're now starting this new project called Upstream Media, where we are acquiring digital media companies in Brazil.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah, that
It's really
reach
exciting.
millions of people in audience. And the whole theory behind this is that getting access to audiences at scale is really critical because, again, the stories that people consume really shape their worldview. And right now, a lot of the stories that are winning are really bad ones, that bring out the worst in us and not the best in us. So the whole idea with Upstream is to acquire media companies that reach audiences of millions and then embedding into their editorial stories that are more uplifting or that center the values that we want to see out in the world and the mental models that we want to propagate. So that's that's what we've been doing. And my background is in activism. I co-founded and ran NOSAS, which is a membership driven campaigning organization. And I ran that for 12 years, that large membership organization now. So I spent essentially a decade mobilizing people around political issues. And
Yeah.
then towards the end of that time, I started a show, a comedy show on HBO Latin America, which became one of the most watched comedy news shows in the region. And that was my first kind of foray into the world of film and TV. And the thing that became clear to me, the thing that kind of broke me open and rebuilt me in a way professionally, is that um, the limiting factor for some of the biggest challenges of our time, including how we treat people caught up in the justice system, which is part of
Yeah.
the conversation that we're having, is almost never policy. It's rarely resources. It's often culture. It's whether ordinary people see each other and see other people as fully human. And culture is made in specific places, right? In the case of Brazil, it's made in the soap operas, it's made in comedy shows, it's made in the gossip pages on Instagram that people scroll through at midnight. So that's where I decided to go, right? Like Piri works inside those spaces through TV, documentary, digital media, trying to kind of shift the cultural water that policy swims in, if you will.
I
So
like that
that's what I
analogy.
do.
Yeah. And tell us a bit more about, the sort of the criminal justice side of work that you've done where, where your work has sort of touched upon those issues.
Yeah, so I think we have to take seriously this idea that dehumanization is not an accident, right? It is
Yeah.
produced. And it's produced by many different levers of power, if you will. But I think very crucially, it is produced by a media system and a media diet that consistently shows people in the justice system as threats, as cases, as numbers, never really as full human beings with histories and futures and people who love them and families. One of the very first campaigns that I ran around this theme back when I was a campaigner, not a storyteller specifically, but it was around the families of people in prisons in Rio. So we had a whole campaign to essentially pressure the legislators in Rio to make it illegal for prisons to do what they called, I think it was called mechanical searches of the families that were
Yeah.
essentially looking to visit their loved ones in prison, which is essentially like manual searches
Yeah.
that tended to
Yeah.
be very, very humiliating and sometimes violent when there's already
Yeah.
so much technology that can be deployed and it's not particularly expensive to do so.
Yeah.
And for that campaign, we would stand in line in prison lines when people were waiting to go visit and talk to them about the campaign and collect their
Yeah.
signatures on a petition. And that gave me, I think, interesting insight into how mostly women, right? Like I'm saying families, but
Yeah.
if you've ever stood around a prison, it's
Yeah.
tragically mostly women visiting their
Yeah.
kids or visiting
Yeah.
their husbands or their
Yeah.
loved ones. There's
Yeah.
and female prisons are sadly almost devoid of visitors. It's very
Yeah.
strange.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm saying all this to say that I think that when I was there, one of the
Mm.
hardest things that we found during that campaign was telling that story in the media in a way that felt compelling, because in many ways, the biggest barrier to getting societal buy-in to this idea that required some level of
Yeah.
investment, right? Like society needed to invest into technology so that these families wouldn't be subject to this. But one of the biggest barriers was getting people who are not part of the justice system, who are not deeply or personally impacted by the prison system in particular, to see not only the people inside prisons, but their families as human. And
Yeah.
that to me, I mean, it's so very clearly artificially made, right? Like and that's why I really believe that we have to get inside the places where culture is actually made, right? Like not the think tanks and the conferences, but the writers' rooms, the production companies, the social media accounts, where 100 millions spend their evenings, right? It means building relationships between justice reformers and the people who make mass culture so that humanizing stories become normal rather than exceptional. And that to me is really crucial to this particular problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And sort of drawing on your experience, particularly in those spaces, in
Yeah.
those, journalism spaces, in those TV studios, in those social media spaces, how have you gone about making those spaces more human and humanizing, people in the justice system, and how has that
Yeah.
been when you've tried to go into those spaces, and what's worked?
Yeah, we had a particular experience that I loved, which was bringing writers, writers that write mostly for streaming, so for series, um, to a prison in Minas, in this state of Brazil, that is a very peculiar place where the 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 entire system is very different from the reality of most of the prison system in Brazil, and they're called apaches, and they have this system where essentially the people inside, so I don't know how to say the proper words in English, but the prisoners essentially
Yeah.
hold the keys to the prison, and it's very
Um,
kind of self-organized, and there is a lot of, and when I first heard that story, I was like, oh my God, a prison where the prisoners hold the key to the prison. That sounds amazing
yeah.
and very strange, and so outside of what we expect a prison to be. And when I
Mm.
told writers that that place existed, they were so excited by the prospects of getting to know that. And we traveled there, and
Yeah.
we had a team of writers who went there um, and met the inmates
Wow.
and spent a day there, and 1,000 stories came out of that,
Yeah.
from like little things and different projects that we're working on to a one big project for a film. But
Amazing.
I think part of making those places more human is just trusting that when both cultural producers and audiences, ultimately, because that's who you're trying to reach
Yeah.
ultimately, when they encounter a three-dimensional human being
Yeah.
who has been through the justice system, that they respond with empathy. And I really, from my experience, they always do. We just
Yeah.
don't give them enough opportunities to do so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And were there any that didn't have that experience that, sort of needed more work, or was it, that really once they were in that setting, they then started to see those human stories?
Yeah. I think that in order to see the humanness in each other, we yeah, the setup is really important, right? Like it's very
Yeah.
hard to do that when you're caught up in a place, and it could
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
a place of ideas or a physical place
Mm.
that tells you that some people are less than. So,
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Um, and if you've talked about, the APAC model and some of the things, if you had a sort of a magic wand, and we wanted to, imagine this sort of more human justice system, but also a more human world where people are seen, where people in the justice system are seen as human.
yeah,
What would that look like? What would we be seeing, feeling,
yeah,
hearing? What stories will be being told? Within that, more human system.
yeah. I think it would really feel like repair rather than punishment. I have a personal story in my own family of violent death. One of my father's brothers, his baby brother, was killed when he was 21, and my grandmother lived with that for her whole life. She
Yeah.
actually just passed away 2 years ago, and I was very
Oh,
close to her, and that was definitely something that, yeah, that changed her profoundly. I think losing a
yeah.
child in that way is never something that you can really recover from. But I and the person that supposedly murdered my uncle was caught, which is very rare in Brazil. We're not even sure if it was the right person, but someone was
Yeah.
apparently caught,
Yeah.
and that never gave my grandmother peace. So I
Yeah.
think that this system, this transformed human justice system, would feel like repair rather than punishment, and that is true of the victim, and it is true of the offender. um,
Yeah.
that's to me the most fundamental shift, right? Like how do we design from a system, how do we move from a system designed to cage and to isolate, to one designed to restore something, and that could be dignity and relationships and the possibility of a future for the person that committed the offense. But the same can be said of the victim or the families of the victims. How do we also move to a system designed to restore their faith, their peace of mind, their ability to move through the world, which will never be the same after a violent crime, I don't think. But after a violent crime is committed against a loved one. But there's definitely, we can do better than what we're doing now, which is essentially not doing much, right? And I think it would sound like people's names being used in a way, like not case numbers, not the offender and the victim and the accused
Yeah.
and but names, stories will look like families being kept together or meeting each other, communities being part of the process. I think that really changes the kind of feeling of things. And culturally, and this is in a way the part that I care most about, it would look like a society that no longer needs kind of a tough on crime narrative to feel
Yeah.
safe, right? Because people would understand safety through the kind of ideas of connection,
Mhm.
of community, of presence, of opportunity, not cages. And we've
Yeah.
been sold a cage for so long that we've forgotten that there were always other options. And I worry now that the cage narrative is only gaining more traction in Latin America. Like if you look at El Salvador and other
Yeah.
places where we've been told that this is what safe looks like. Safe
Yeah.
looks like 10% of the population being locked away in a cage.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really true. And that's these stories of safety and what that looks like and how have you seen examples where there's those stories of community, of connection, those alternative stories are reaching those
people,
audiences? Yeah.
yeah, so we're trying a few things, right? Like we in my own work, we're now working, as I said, to acquire digital media companies. And one of the areas in which we're trying to work is in the gossip in slash entertainment slash lifestyle, like Instagram world, which is a very, very crucial world in Brazil. Millions of people follow gossip pages. They follow these huge Instagram pages that
Yeah.
essentially talk about celebrities and the latest soap opera
Yeah.
and lifestyle and relationships and so on. They're very vibrant businesses. I mean, they're viable
Yeah.
businesses and they reach very large audiences. And we started looking into buying some of them. And as
Yeah.
an experiment, we started running a few posts on them about different topics and seeing how the
Okay.
audience would respond. And they can be really interesting vehicles for humanizing stories. Um, because you kind of, not because it's perfect, obviously. I mean, this is not
Yeah.
necessarily a media model that we all aspire towards, but it is meeting people where they are. And
Yeah.
this is what they're actually consuming.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then when you are able to work into a story that is a profoundly human story about the justice system into these places, the response can sometimes be very surprising
Yeah.
because these are audiences that are not used to being confronted by these stories in a way that doesn't feel like technical or overly political. Um,
Yeah.
and so they respond from a human perspective, and that can be unsettling sometimes because, the feelings of wanting revenge and hatred, those are also human feelings.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but there's also a lot of empathy that comes through. There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of honestly grappling with the consequences of the systems that we've built that comes through. So I've seen that firsthand. It's been really interesting.
Amazing. And what, just out of interest, where those stories have sort of got through, are there places then for people to kind of go and get more information or sort of what happens with these conversations, sort of
Yeah.
how are they moderated at all? Or are they kind of, does it carry on
No,
after that initial story or is it just
for
out there in
now, for
the
now,
world?
we're mostly thinking about changing again, as I said, like this kind of cultural water. And
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily means expecting that a single post on Instagram is going to lead to some sort of action that's going to have a policy
Yeah.
implication right away. But it does mean that the way that we portray certain recurrent stories over time builds different mental models and ways of seeing the world. And crime and punishment are already a big kind of editorial
Yeah.
for these pages. So celebrity pages, lifestyle pages, gossip pages already cover crime and punishment quite often. Mostly because these stories generate engagement, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how you then tell these stories really matters, right? Like it
Yeah.
matters because um, not because again you necessarily going to click through for more information, but because the recurrence builds
Yeah. Yeah.
builds mental models. So if
Yeah.
every time you're seeing a story on crime and punishment, it is portrayed through a certain light, and there's an expectation of something, or there's a call for more prisons or more guards or more whatever, like that is going to shape how you then start seeing that theme
Yeah. Yeah.
throughout your life. So we're really making a bet on that kind of surround system tactic, right? Like how do we surround people um, with better frames for certain stories, and
Yeah,
how
because
that
it's
then
that
builds
volume,
over
isn't it?
time.
It's the scale of the other ones, like you said. It's that cage
Yeah,
story is just the scale of that. So to try and
it's
kind of,
everywhere.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
We did
exactly.
I was involved in some work in the UK working with journalists around, awards for journalists that, were reporting in less sensationalist ways and more, sort of solution focused ways. And then
Mm-hmm.
we actually started a project working with journalism students, um, having them meet people with lived experience of the justice system, bringing those human stories, before they do the court reporting and report in sensationalist ways, but have that earlier on. So I think, yeah, everything that we can do working directly with those sort of content
Yeah,
makers is really, really valuable. I love
yeah,
that.
absolutely.
And in terms of, coming, like we've talked about some of the barriers, I guess, for this,
Mm-hmm.
what do you see as like the biggest barriers to these stories not being shared
Out there.
more often out there? Yeah.
Yeah. So there are a few things, right? Like first, I think there is a barrier that comes from inside our world, or the world of philanthropy, or the world of people who are traditionally involved with change, and trying to push for a better, more human um, criminal justice system. And the barrier there, I would say, is almost like this mental barrier where narrative change is seen as the kind of soft cousin to real change. And we have to
Yeah.
stop treating culture as the soft cousin to the real change. It is the real change, right? Like policy happens inside culture, not separate from it. Political will and public resources only flow towards issues that people believe are valuable, that they believe affect people like them or people they care about, and that belief is itself in itself cultural, right? It's made, and the other side understands this, right? The punitive carceral lobby has always
Yeah.
understood that whoever controls the story controls the policy, and they have invested in that for decades, and I think we need to match that seriousness. So I would say that, to answer your question more directly, like first, the narrative ecosystem is dominated by fear and punishment. Crime stories in popular media almost universally focus on the act and on enforcement, never on the person, never on what came before or might come after. And that is a neutral that shapes what people believe it's normal, what they believe is just. So changing that requires deliberate, sustained investment in counter narratives. Second, there is a gap between the people doing justice reform work and the people who control how it's represented publicly. So
Yeah.
reports and policy papers are essential, of course, but they don't reach the person scrolling through their phone after work. And we need deeper, more trusting collaboration between reformers and storytellers, and that infrastructure barely exists.
Yeah.
And third, I think race and class make it very easy to sustain dehumanization, right? In Brazil and in most countries, the people most affected by the justice system are Black, poor, peripheral. So the narratives that keep the system in place are inseparable from those hierarchies. And you cannot build a genuinely human justice system without confronting that directly. And that also means ensuring that cultural producers um, are more exposed to those stories, which most likely they won't be, because the cultural industry, just like any other industries,
Yeah.
um, is also shaped by race and class hierarchies. So the
Yeah.
people in
Yeah.
positions of power are very unlikely to be directly affected by many
Mm.
failures of our criminal justice system. Yeah. So
Yeah.
every strategy
Yeah.
kind of has to reckon with that in a way, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it reminds me of that six conditions of system change model where, you kind of got mindset change at the bottom as that, absolutely core. And unless you've got that, all
It's
those
going to be very
other
hard to do the
elements
rest. Yeah.
is on, or to sustain it. You can get some of those policy changes for maybe a short while, but then you have an electoral cycle and some, you know, and you get the pushback on those to, I think, to maintain and sustain those policy changes. That's, you know,
Yeah.
where you need those surrounding waters. But I wanted to ask you actually about how do we prevent harms to people with, you know, lived experience of the justice system, who are the ones that, you know, have the stories, that are telling their stories, you know, and because, you know, sometimes, you know, it can be that they're almost reduced to their stories, or telling their whole story, or telling their story in ways which re-traumatizes, which can cause
Hmm.
harm, which is then used in ways in which they haven't consented
Yeah.
to. You know, what are some of the ways that you've seen to overcome some of those, you know, to reduce those harms of, you know, of potentially telling
Yeah.
stories?
That's a very good question. Um, I think it really depends on what kind of cultural product we're talking about, right? Like often when we talk about telling stories, we think about cultural products that tell one cohesive story from beginning to end. So let's say a series or a film, or a soap opera, like you follow a character storyline. And that those could be based in real characters, and these people are real people in the world, and they can be harmed by the way their story is or isn't told. So in those cases, I think there is a lot of thinking already around the ethics of telling stories, and it could be in documentary filmmaking, it could be in narrative, but almost inevitably, the ethics of that will revolve around ideas of course, consent and involvement, getting people with the lived experience in the writer's room, in production seats, in positions of power, so that they have more control over how their story is made, or told rather. So that is one thing. There's another part of storytelling that I think is harder for us to grapple with, which is again not the cultural products that tell the story from beginning to end, but the multitude cultural moments that together, almost to this kind of mosaic, tell stories more broadly. So when something happens and there is a very real person at the center of that, whatever it is, um, particularly if it's a big kind of newsworthy story, that won't necessarily, at least not immediately, become a film with a cohesive point of view, but that will be reported by 1,000 different outlets and then reposted and re-talked about and rediscussed. And
Yeah.
that chatter machine, that is a very hard thing to, well, control, let alone um,
Yeah.
have an ethical framework to work with that, right? and
Yeah.
and I think part of um we can only really think about that and protecting the people at the core of these stories if we take the challenge of influencing that chatter machine more seriously. We
Yeah.
cannot leave it to chance. We
Yeah.
cannot leave it to, oh yeah, whatever, you know, the people are talking about in social media, as if that were an organic process that no one has no control over. I mean, not only tech platforms have an enormous amount of control into
Mm.
which stories are uplifted and how, and which frames are the ones that are, but
Yeah.
also again, like the kind of punitive carceral lobby has done a lot in terms of making sure that they can reach audiences
Mm.
at scale in that fragmented way. And if we're not doing the same, then we cannot protect the people that we want to protect. So that is, I think, a harder question than the one about like the kind of very cohesive cultural products.
Yeah, yeah, fascinating. And yeah, it comes back to your point about, yeah, you've got to be in there, and why you're taking this new strategy of working, you know, within
Yeah.
those sectors. And how much, Alessandra, do you work across different countries, different regions, thinking about stories, you know, particularly criminal justice
Yeah.
stories, you know, across, you know, different regions, and why is it important that we hear stories from, yeah,
Different places, right?
from different
Yeah.
places?
I mean, my work is very much centered on Brazil, like my day-to-day work, and I really do believe that kind of contextual rootedness is
Yeah.
important to being able to do this with integrity. However, I also sit on global boards. I've published in other countries. I travel a lot, luckily, and that gives me, I think, an ability to see what's structural versus what's contingent. I think that's one of the best things about having that kind of transnational lens, even though the work itself may be super local. And that's how we know, right, that the dehumanization of people in the justice system is structural. It shows up everywhere. And however, the cultural infrastructure through which you fight is very context specific. In Brazil, soap operas reach half the country in a single evening, right? Like every evening. In the UK, it's not going to be that, right? In the US, it could be a Netflix documentary that everyone watches. Like you have to understand the specific terrain you're working on. And I think being across countries and seeing across countries keeps me honest about that. It stops me from universalizing solutions that are actually local. However, the problems are often quite structural and transnational in nature. So,
yeah. And that dehumanization theme is everywhere.
It's everywhere.
That's the core of it. And not just in criminal justice. I guess your work covers those different issues. There's a lot of learning that we can do, I guess, as whether it's migration, whether it's those other spaces. It's dehumanization is one of the big issues of our time, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
And I wanted to ask you about your just some recommendations really for people that are listening to this, that are interested in your work, particularly around this angle of stories, this angle of sort of humanizing through culture and through storytelling. What are your kind of inspirations? What are your sort of go-to things that if people are interested in this, that they could read or they could watch or they could listen to find out more about this work?
So there's two reads that I love that I know are available in English, because not everything is, but that are from English speaking authors. So one is I really love the work of Andrew Solomon. And I know this is, he's a best-selling author, so maybe some of our listeners, some of our audience will have already may already know him. I love his best-selling book, Far from the Tree, which tells the stories of families with kids that are very different from their parents, and he will work around or tell stories that center around different kinds of difference. So it could be hearing parents that are parents to deaf children, but he also has a very particular chapter about the parents of children who have committed terrible crimes.
Oh, wow.
And it's beautifully written, and I think Andrew is just one of these authors, journalists, etc., that are really good about telling the very specific human stories while keeping a broader frame. But it's never wonky. It's always very emotional. And I read this book when I was pregnant with my second child, and it was so important to me. And so much so, in fact, that I then reached out to Andrew Solomon, who responded, and we became friends.
Oh, amazing.
So now and I
you don't ask, you don't get.
I interviewed him recently for my podcast, which is in Brazil, but the interview was in English, except for the opening, which was in Portuguese. But if you Google Alessandra Orofino, Andrew Solomon interview, you can find it, and you can see my conversation with him. He's a lovely human. So I would definitely recommend him and all of his work. And then there's a more recent, more kind of political book that I read. It's Naomi Klein's latest, The Doppelganger. And I think with all of Naomi Klein's work, like, people often come to it expecting a book about politics. But in this particular case, they end up with this kind of masterclass in how narrative shapes political reality, right? Like how fear travels, how dehumanization gets built into a worldview, how the far right has occupied cultural and psychological space that other movements and parts of the political spectrum left empty. So it's not directly about criminal justice, but it's absolutely about the mechanics of how stories become policy. And I think anyone working on narrative change in this space needs to understand those mechanics. So I highly recommend The Doppelganger as well. So those are my two recommendations: Far from the Tree and The Doppelganger.
Fantastic. And we'll make sure we share those with our listeners as well. That's fantastic. And is there anything, you mentioned where, people can find you to find that interview, but where else can people find you? On your website, other ways to find out a bit more about your work?
Yeah, you should definitely check out pettyprod.com, which is our website. We're actually changing it because there's a lot that we've been doing that is not there yet. And I have a very popular podcast in Brazil called Calma Urgente, urgently calm in Portuguese.
Yeah.
It's very Brazilian. It's very it's in Portuguese first off, but on YouTube you can find some of the episodes, and then YouTube has automatic English
Yeah.
translation. So if you're interested in
Oh,
Brazilian
amazing.
politics and getting some analysis of that, that could be interesting. And one of my
Yeah.
latest documentaries, which was nominated for a BAFTA actually, and an Emmy
Mm.
this week, is on
Incredible.
Netflix.
Congratulations.
Yeah, and that's on Netflix. It's called Apocalypse in the Tropics. And yeah, you can watch it anywhere on Netflix. So if you look that up, you can find it as well.
That's incredible. Oh, thank you so much. And I think this has been a really important contribution to this broader series of conversations we've been having about thinking about that, the waters of the cultural waters that we're swimming in, and actually in order to to achieve those policy changes, those legislative changes, just how important it is to think about how we humanize those stories, how we engage with unlikely actors within our, whether that's influencers or soap operas. So it's been a really timely reminder of that. And is there any sort of final things that you want people to sort of, takeaways that you want people to think about after listening to this?
Uh no, I mean, I think we've said it all, but mostly I would urge all of us, yeah, to think about those kind of those cultural frames and how much they shape the world that we're trying to change, but also in many ways how they shape ourselves, right? Like, we're also swimming in culture, and some of our assumptions about what works and what doesn't work may also be culturally shaped and determined. So challenging our own cultural biases, I think, is always a good thing to do. It's a good
I love
reminder.
that. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Alessandra, for your time. It's been fascinating. And we
Thank you,
really look forward to
Nina.
seeing you on the 28th of April and hearing more then.
Likewise.
And we'll
I'll
make
see
sure
you
we share this
then.
widely. Thank you so much.